from Long Bay College to give the address.
We find ourselves gathered here today to not only honour those who have fought, but rather in a state of self-reflection. Self-reflection for how ourselves, our families, and our nation can be irrevocably shaped by the process of war. This feeling of introspection is no more poignant than who I am currently, a 17-year-old male. Although 20 was technically considered the minimum age to enlist in the New Zealand Army in 1914, a lack of any birth certificates meant that I, along with approximately 250,000 men throughout the British Empire, could enlist in the Army while still being a teenager. For many of these boys, the patriotic fervour swept up with New Zealand's declaration of war in August 1914 brushed aside any real understanding of what armed conflict entailed, all with a thirst for adventure, camaraderie and stories. It is understandable that for the Kiwi-born teenager in 1914, who on average travelled less than 50 kilometres from their place of birth in their entire lifetime, the promise of thrilling encounters in exotic lands was an all too irresistible temptation. I speak about this because one such teenager to enlist in the New Zealand Army was my great-grandfather, Frederick Charles Clement Calder. For him, it was the prospect of adventure that inspired him to join a form of combat which at the time was in its infancy, aviation. As New Zealand did not have an air force of its own, my great-grandfather travelled all the way to England and completed flight training at his own expense to become a pilot in early 1915. For the next 4 years, he would engage in various operations all over Europe, from the Greek islands of Thasos and Salonika to the Dardanelles post-Gallipoli on the HMS Ark Royale, and even off the coast of England, protecting it against Zeppelin attacks. By the war's conclusion, he had attained the rank of flight lieutenant, honourably discharged, remarkable considering the average life expectancy for a pilot was a mere 11 days. He returned home intact, thankfully something my great-grandfather on the other side of my family, Donald George Warbank, who served in Guadalcanal during World War II as a cook, was also able to do. However, they were the lucky ones. Since the start of the 20th century, approximately 30,170 New Zealanders have died in conflict. The Gallipoli campaign would ultimately fail to achieve the objectives it set out to do, and although the death toll was horrendously high, it was by no means the costliest toll we would pay. The question is then why, out of all the battles New Zealand soldiers fought in, has Gallipoli come to encapsulate our commemorative events today? There is no exact answer to this question, but perhaps it was because it was Gallipoli, where the first of the wide-eyed ANZAC troops found themselves thrust into the bloodied conflict that was war. And yet, despite this tremendous horror occurring all around them, the unique identity that both New Zealanders and Australians share, the ANZAC spirit, triumphed. It is testament that when struck by grief as we learnt about the true cost of war, did we not find ourselves shattered in pieces as a nation, as what would be expected, but as one, held together by a new identity forged by the brave soldiers and the ANZAC spirit which so many young men had died to preserve. Their timelessness is not so much a result of their courageous deeds or harrowing tales, but rather because they are a parallel to New Zealand society's own experience of war. The innocence held as we entered into conflict, the sacrifices made during, and our changed nature afterwards. When we talk about the spirit of ANZAC, one of camaraderie, courage, sacrifice and duty, we talk to the fundamental traits which are stirred into action when we as humans find ourselves with the need, regardless of whether history will judge it as being right or wrong, to stand up and defend the values upon which our society is formed. Consequently, the ANZAC spirit isn't applicable to all ages, sexes, faiths, nationalities, regardless of which side they pledge allegiance to, as we are all joined by the common bond of humanity's complex relationship with conflict. We remember the deeds of those who have sacrificed their lives in order to preserve and rekindle a nation's sense of identity. May all of us be guided by the ANZAC spirit that exists in every one of us, and let us strive to be worthy of the memory of those we honour today. Thank you.